I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman. Pat, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine. Lovely day here in Los Angeles. Going to be about 74 degrees. Sound of lawnmowers going outside, all the yard work happening. It's a nice day. It's bright and sunshiny.
It's a lovely day in Cincinnati, but for us at this time of year, that means about 50 degrees. So,
ooh, 50 is nice.
It's not too bad, considering that it is the middle of February, which is usually the worst month in this goddamn city. Before we get into today's topic, I will let everyone know we're going to be talking about Randamie, Holm. You were probably disappointed by UFC 208 as a fight fan. I enjoyed it, but I also like middleweights. History has proven that I am easy to please as far as combat sports are concerned. So, but it was certainly an interesting card. Holm, Randamie, controversial. I thought a very intriguing kickboxing match between them. Some new wrinkles from Holm that made it a different fight than it could have been otherwise. And there were a couple other instances of interesting combat on the card that we will be discussing in depth and possibly getting into the nitty gritty of, judging, refereeing, stuff like that. All of those things had an impact at UFC 208. But before we dive into those topics, I have a couple of announcements for which I realize we probably need a sound effect. You know what I mean? We need something like...
For sure. We need Jimmy Lennon Jr. to introduce them.
Right. That would be great. How are your mouth noises, Pat? Can you do a bugle?
Not good. Not good enough.
That's the best I can do. Announcements, couple of things. First of all, a shout out to our Twitter friend, Lucas Bordone, whose cat died recently. So sorry, buddy. Hope you're feeling okay. But what we wanted to get to is regarding a Patreon page. Pat and I were discussing this last week. Currently on our Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone who has supported us, but currently on our Patreon, we have our $1 reward listed as a thank you on the show. And that is a mistake, for which both Pat and I apologize. That was left up from when the reward tier was, I believe the old $3 tier was a thank you on the show, which made it a little more feasible. But obviously, we cannot get to 195 patrons every single month, and thank all of you on the show. And I'm sure you guys who support us wouldn't like that, because there would be a lot less show if we dedicated our time to doing that, or the episodes would be a lot longer, and you'd probably skip the first 20 minutes anyway. So that is a mistake, and I apologize, but I do want to invite everyone who is a $1 patron to our private Slack discussion board. It's something that used to be a $10 reward on Patreon before Pat and I realized we didn't really have as much time as we would have liked to engage in it. So we got rid of it. Now, we cannot promise going forward that we're going to be in there a lot, but we can set it up as a private place for us to occasionally dip in whenever we're able, and of course for you guys as Heavy Hands listeners and dedicated fight fans to discuss. You can go in there for live fight discussions or whatever you want to use it for. It'll basically just be a private chat room for listeners of the show who have donated $1 or more, which means all of our patrons. So it may be a kind of a clumsy process, and in the coming weeks I will figure out how best to get all of your guys' information and add you to the forum, and it may take a little while to get it going. But let me know how you feel about that idea. If you're interested in it, that's something that we can offer you for a $1 contribution, because I firmly believe that anything is better than nothing, and we really appreciate all of you who dedicate a little bit of your wallet to our production here. So thank you guys, and we will sort that out in the coming weeks, but that is what we're planning to do going forward. And again, if you're a $20 patron, we still have some people who have not sent us topics. So send us your topics and your heavy bag questions. If you have not in a few months, then we're waiting on those. And that's about it for announcements. Imagine a closing sound effect here. And now let's get on to the show. Patrick, Holm, Randamie, a meaningless belt. What did you make of the UFC 208 main event?
I thought that Holm looked like Holm, and it was not enough to get the job done. I understand that there were a lot of scorecards out there for Holm, and I am puzzled by that.
Same
I'm
here.
Really puzzled. It seems to me to be the product of a couple of different things. First of all, Holm's activity. She throws a lot. She always throws a lot. Problem is she doesn't land very much. She is not an especially accurate striker. And while I wouldn't go so far as to characterize what she does as kind of beating up the air in front of her, she does not land a ton of strikes. Like Randamie actually landed more than Holm did per fight metric. And I don't think there's any question that she landed the harder, cleaner shots over the course of the fight. One of the things that we've seen come to the fore lately a lot, I mean, I think it's been happening for a while, but it's really kind of becoming an issue now, is it seems like fans, media, judges especially, it's only really a problem for them, are having a hard time seeing counter punches. That really seems to be a problem. So when one fighter's offense or best offense consists almost entirely of counters, as Randamie's did in this fight, especially in the context of exchanges, it's really, really hard for people to see those. But I thought Randamie landed the better shots, the cleaner shots. I thought she won 3, maybe 4 rounds. I don't think Holm landed much that was especially damaging over the course of the fight. Like I understand how the fight could have been scored for Holm, but I remain somewhat puzzled at the sheer number of people who did.
To me, it's more extreme than scoring Alvarez Pettis for Alvarez by a good margin. In a similar sort of fight where Alvarez has forward pressure and a lot of control in the clinch, both of us thought that Anthony Pettis did enough damage and was impactful enough with his striking to win the fight. I think this is a more extreme example of that, where I'm not puzzled, really, that Eddie Alvarez got that decision, though I disagree with it. I'm a little puzzled that people saw Holly's work in the clinch and at range as more effective than what Germaine de Randamie did. There are many sequences in this fight where Holly Holm had a minute of control against the fence, but as soon as de Randamie gets space, you have 3 vicious knees to the body or a hard punch on the break. And to me, that minute of control is meaningless if it cannot prevent those strikes and set up some equally effective ones for Holm.
Judging by any scoring criteria, any meaningful scoring criteria that could possibly be in place for anybody, the hard shots should absolutely negate the control.
Yeah.
Like this is not controversial. That's just how fights are supposed to be scored. I mean, I don't want to get into a huge debate about scoring here.
Yeah.
The only reason that the scoring bit is meaningful, I think, is because it speaks to the nature of the fight. Like this was a classic old school Greg Jackson game plan, in the sense that he was dealing with a fighter who was suffering from some technical deficits in comparison to the opposition. So it was, let's do everything that we can to try to minimize our fighter's flaws and shorten the fight, in essence, in order to give the impression to the judges that we're winning. And like, that is not a knock on this, and it's not a knock on Holm. I thought it was a really smart game plan.
Yeah, I agree. I was hoping to see her come in and make some wrestling adjustments and try to because everyone knows that's de Randamie's weakness. She's more powerful, she's faster at range than Holly Holm, and she's similarly skilled, if not more so. So it absolutely makes sense to try to change phases and keep things interesting. And I respect the fact that they were able to do that with some level of success. And you can't deny the fact that Holly Holm got more effective as the fight went on to some degree. But yeah, I want to ask you actually, Pat, about the counterpunches. Our final word sort of related to scoring, I guess. You've said this in the past, and I wonder why you think counterpunches are hard to see, because I don't know if it's just my eye from having watched so many fights, but it's really hard for me to miss the kind of counterpunches that Germaine de Randamie was landing on Holm. You know what I mean? Like when somebody misses big and gets hit hard in return, their head snaps back or whatever, that to me is the most obvious kind of strike. That's the kind of strike where the deficit between the aggressor and the counterer is most clear. And a lot of Germaine's counters were of that variety, where Holly Holm was missing big and Germaine was really cracking her with a hard shot.
So that was the case, I think, in the early rounds, that basically everybody scored for de Randamie. Okay. I think as the
Except
fight
for
went
one of
on,
the judges who scored round 2 for Holly Holm.
That is puzzling to me. I don't know how you
but
could
still scored round 3, in which Germaine was head kicked for Germaine. So I have no idea what the hell is going on in New York.
I mean, MMA judging, woo, it's always an adventure.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think in the first couple of rounds, those punches were real big, real clear, and real obvious. And as the fight went on, as Holm did, it took Holm about about 15 minutes to really find her range. She only finally got her range about the end of the third round. You notice after that she was closer. She was landing better. She was landing better punches. She was landing better kicks. She was getting into them more. The counters were really obvious, I think, for the first 10 minutes. They got slightly less over the course of the third round. In the fourth, Randamie was still landing them well. In the fifth, she was still landing them pretty well. But there was usually a Holm strike that followed right afterwards, and then it looks like an exchange, and that looks like it's even. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Like, I think that's the problem is when you throw like a big Conor McGregor inside angle counter, you can't miss that,
right?
Because that's the last punch that gets thrown in an exchange. If Conor McGregor hits you with an inside angle counter, you're not throwing something after that.
So you think particularly the counters that are landed in the midst of heated exchanges are the ones that people, judges and fans, have difficulty seeing?
Exactly. So so another example of this would be the Miller-Poirier fight. If Poirier had not finished his combinations with another shot or two, which is what he always does, he was winning those exchanges regardless, even before he threw the last 2 or 3 punches to put a stamp on them. But you could see how, looking at that, you would think, well, Poirier landed and Miller landed, so we'll call that a wash. Right? Even though Poirier was landing the cleaner, harder shots.
Because Miller might get hit 3 times, but he would halt Poirier's momentum, perhaps, with a good, clean counter, and that would make it look like he had answered in kind, even if he had actually absorbed more damage.
Exactly. Yeah. That I think exchanges are trickier to score in MMA than they are in boxing. I really think the more time I spend on this, that it has a lot to do with the gloves. That in boxing, when the gloves are moving, they're bigger, it's harder to miss them. In MMA, you can miss a good clean counter shot if it's quick enough and fast enough, and there's some other kind of movement happening at the same time that draws your eye away.
I have an easy and attractive solution. Make the UFC gloves white.
Yeah.
I think white gloves are a lot easier to see, and they look good. They look classy. So
I would actually be for that. I mean, because it seems to me this is actually becoming a problem, right? Like or even silver, if they made them that kind of steel gray or
something
silver
that catches the light.
Uses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because it seems to me that this really is becoming an actual problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, but leaving that aside, what did you think of the fight itself, Connor?
I think the big thing that I took away after having some time to stew over it, to let it stew, I suppose, to chew on it, all food-related things. I guess I'm hungry. Haven't had lunch, sorry. After getting a chance to think on the fight, I think my final analysis was really that it cemented for me the fact that Holly Holm is not an adaptive fighter. And those types of fighters, I think, are the most susceptible to being what folks in the MMA community like to call exposed. Because a few things really stood out. Like, for example, let's contrast Holly Holm with Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is, at least in some ways, a better adapter than Holly Holm. In many ways, you could say. When Conor McGregor dropped Nate Diaz in their second fight, he had learned the lessons of the previous fight. Now, he had the benefit of having fought the same man, but Holly Holm had the benefit of having fought a good counter striker in Valentina Shevchenko, and her second performance against Germaine de Randamie was not markedly different from that one, except for the wrestling. When Conor McGregor dropped Nate Diaz, his instinct, what he had been training himself for all these years to do, was to jump on Nate and finish him. And his corner screamed at him not to, and he didn't. And that was a very, very important factor in that fight, that Conor McGregor was disciplined, but also that he was willing to sort of fight his instincts. Holly Holm's instincts, to me, seem to be entirely tied to her game plan. So that when she game plans to wrestle Germaine de Randamie and drops de Randamie in the 5th round with a clean straight left that de Randamie runs right into, Ronda Rousey style, and she wrestles de Randamie afterwards, and her corner is screaming at her, just like John Kavanagh did to McGregor, to stop wrestling and kickbox because GDR is hurt, and Holly doesn't listen in the moment because the game plan is what she does. And there are many great fighters who are completely tied to their game plans, but I think that has become more and more a pressing issue for Holly as a mixed martial artist, especially against other strikers, because those are the ones that can hurt her and make her look bad and clearly win rounds. The volume does not work as well for the judges when the other person is landing clean shots and not just, failing to take you down or missing as much as you miss.
Yeah, I think we may have underestimated with Holm the extent to which her many, many years in the sport have kind of set her in stone.
Yeah.
Like because she had such a long career as a striker, it's not uncommon, not to be clear, it's not uncommon to see strikers come into MMA, right? We've seen a lot of strikers with fairly extensive backgrounds get into MMA.
Yeah, particularly in women's MMA these days.
Mm-hmm. But if you're 33 and you get into MMA, or 32 or whatever Holm was not young when she started fighting in MMA.
Yeah.
You are more or less the striker you're going to be at that point.
Especially when you've been boxing for over like 11 or 12 years before that.
Yeah, I mean, and boxing at a high level too, boxing professionally.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like Holm was a dilettante or fighting in like C-class kickboxing matches in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was at as close to the top of that sport as exists. So I think, and when you've been trained that whole time by somebody who is a pretty rote coach in Mike Winklejohn, I think he puts together pretty rote combinations on the pads. That's at least what I've seen from him in person. And a really great game planning coach in Greg Jackson. Like, you are going to have skill sets that lend themselves to rote game, perhaps even overly game planned approaches. Mm-hmm. And I think that Holm is the fighter her circumstances have made her. And sometimes that works great. If you're trying to stick to a game plan in the face of a pressuring opponent who's going to bull rush you and get after you, that kind of discipline is going to serve you well.
Absolutely.
But if you're faced with an elite kickboxer who can do a whole bunch of different things, who's exceptionally adaptive, who's going to see the things that you're giving her and then adapt and respond, that's not so hot. And we saw, Holm can mix it up a little bit, but for Holm, mixing it up is getting more aggressive and being more willing to get hit.
Yeah, just as in the Shevchenko fight. It's basically, all right, I'm losing, more volume, more aggression, more missed punches.
Let's get blood and guts.
Yeah,
seems to be Holm's adaptive response, not let's switch up the ranges, let's switch up the directionality of movement, let's try this, let's try that.
Which, again, I think you could argue is kind of a hallmark of Winklejohn's fighters. Mm-hmm. Carlos Condit, fighters who just bite down and go when their game plan is not working for them.
Even John Jones in the 4th round against Alexander Gustafsson was okay, fuck it, let's do the damn thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they harness that very well. I think we've obviously critiqued the work of Winklejohn quite a lot. But we definitely have a lot of respect for Jackson Winklejohn, and of course for the new addition to that team in Brandon Gibson and Izzy Martinez. Everybody. Who's Israel Vasquez? It's a boxer. Obviously have a lot of respect for everyone on that team and for what they do. And there are, of course, many great fighters throughout history who are not great adapters. That is a fighter-by-fighter thing sometimes as well. Ruben Olivares, one of the greatest boxers of all time. Not a great adapter. Stuck to his game plan, and when smart fighters figured that out and changed over the course of the fight, he had trouble. So it's not even a career-ending sort of flaw, but it is a flaw for Holly Holm, and I think it's one that now good strikers have figured out.
Yeah, I think if you put Holm in there with somebody who has more of a grappling-based game, like I think if you put her in there with a Kat Zingano or a Juliana Pena or one of any number of fighters at 135 pounds who don't have that kind of base, she would be in much better shape and her game plan would work fine because those fighters aren't equipped to take advantage of Holm's flaws in quite the same way. And frankly, I think if you ran back that fight with Miesha Tate again, I think Holm would win a comfortable decision.
Yeah, she was certainly on her way to doing so, and who knows at that point how much more desire Miesha had left in her, because it certainly seemed she seemed to have exhausted the last of it in that fight. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe here the story after Holly Holm has retired will be one of poor management, really. And that's not something we typically talk about on this show, but her manager, I think, is Lenny Fresquez. And
he is, yep.
And he seemed to treat both Valentina Shevchenko and Germaine de Randamie as easy fights. And I'm not just saying this because we've now seen Holly lose to both of them. I predicted that Holly would lose to both of them. And I think those are arguably two of the worst fights for her around the bantamweight division. They're too dangerous because they offer no name value. It's not like losing to Cyborg. You know what I mean? There's no name value there. There's no big payday, and they're dangerous, skilled strikers, which ironically is exactly the type of fighter who is most likely to be effective against Holly Holm. Is a better kickboxer.
Well, but if your perspective on this, and I'm not saying, I mean, it's his job to understand this context, but if you're looking at your fighter and you're saying, well, I think she's the best striker in this division.
Yeah, but unfortunately her manager, what's that?
Then for sure you put her in there with any striker out there.
I think it's unfortunate, however, that her manager seems to have viewed her skill set the same way UFC marketing did. She's a boxer. She's a pro boxer, so no other striker can beat her. When there are actually very winnable and even favorable matchups for Holly Holm that are high profile, like Juliana Pena. I think Holly Holm could do very well against Amanda Nunes because she would take some shots in the early rounds, but that stamina comes in awfully handy against someone who has a habit of gassing after 7 minutes. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, so this is I think maybe to put a stamp on this segment and transition into the next one.
Yeah.
Like this is why the kind of stylistic archetypes that we advocate on this show, that we think they're more useful than things like striker versus grappler.
Yes.
Because you can be a forward-moving wrestler, or you can be kind of a reactive wrestler. You can be an aggressive grappler, or more of a flowy grappler who lets the fight come to you. You can be there are a lot of different ways to do all of these things. You can be an aggressive striker. You can be an outside fighter. Like these are all possibilities. But you have to understand how those particular things match up with each other, not just the skill sets, because you can apply skill sets in a whole lot of different ways. It's the application of them. It's how you choose to go about imposing that game on your opponent that is going to dictate these kinds of things. Yeah. And maybe Lenny Fresquez should have paid more attention to that.
The real world UFC basically is not UFC undisputed. You do not have a, X out of 100 metric for striking and clinch and wrestling. And jiu-jitsu. It is stylistically determined who is most likely to win a fight. And
because think back to that freaking Shevchenko matchup, right? Can you think of a worse matchup for Holm? I actually think Shevchenko stylistically is a much worse matchup for her than de Randamie is.
Sure.
Like that, because de Randamie landed good counters, but de Randamie is not a counter puncher.
Yeah, she was a lot more willing. I think she fought very smart, by the way. Give her credit for being aggressive, but still waiting mostly on the counters, at least in the early portion of that fight. I think that was very wise, not to lead and walk into the kind of pot shots that, you make Holm a lot more dangerous. You undo a lot of her flaws if you leap into that left hand, as she did in the 5th round and nearly got knocked out. So I think that was wise, but Shevchenko is so disciplined and committed to that counter-punching style of fight that Holly Holm, who is not a good leader or a pressure fighter, has no choice to win the fight but to lead. So yeah, I think Shevchenko is essentially a nightmare matchup for Holly Holm.
Yeah, seriously. So yeah, you're right. We have spent basically this whole segment talking about Holm, but all credit to de Randamie, who had a great game plan, who was really well trained. Her footwork was on point. That counter right hand was gorgeous. Her kicks the timing on her kicks I thought was really good. Like, did you notice that she was doing a fantastic job of when Holm tried to throw those linear kicks, de Randamie was ready to come right back at her and even try to counter kick, like simultaneously kick?
Yeah, I think she could have done a little more with her kicks, but she was timing them well, and perhaps she was cautious about being taken down off of them.
Yeah, I think she knew that Holm was going to try and wrestle her and limited her skill set a bit. I wouldn't be surprised if and when we get de Randamie Cyborg if we see a lot more of de Randamie's kicking game, which is potent and effective.
Yeah,
very,
definitely.
Very good kicker.
Definitely, and I'm at least looking forward to the striking portions of that fight a lot. I think it'll be great. Cyborg's wrestling is what worries me for de Randamie's sake, but
if de Randamie gets taken down, that fight is over in 30 seconds. Literally 30 seconds. I think that fight's over.
Yeah, basically. Can we, before we end this segment, actually, do you want to spare a final word for those fateful late shots after the bell? What's your opinion on that? Because that is very much, I think, part of the controversy surrounding this fight. And part of people's scores who seem to have forgiven a lot of Holly's ineffectiveness because they don't like what de Randamie did, which is not how fights are scored. But
I'll be honest, it didn't I'm not that worried about it. I think it's the referee's job to get in there and make sure that they separate on the bell. That's what the referee's there to do. It was the perfect storm of inexperienced refereing, and I don't know what was going on with de Randamie. Like, I don't know why she didn't hear it twice. I don't think she was intentionally trying to seriously harm.
I think she was trying to fight to the bell and put a stamp on the round. And I think she should have exercised a little more self-control. And clearly she was at least somewhat cognizant of what was going on, because after the referee did give her a hard warning, she did stop doing that at the ends of the rounds. But it is difficult to be totally aware of that when the last 10 seconds of 2 consecutive rounds are flurries, one of which you've just been hurt and made to look bad, and you've got to try to get back and make sure that you win that round. I was far more upset with the referee than I was with Jermaine Randamie.
Yeah, it's because it's at the end of the day, it's the referee's job to do shit about that.
Yeah.
And like, not to be
it's a thankless job, it's.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be like a full-on advocate of Dundasso. As in case you're not familiar with it, Chad Dundas, co-host of the Co-Main Event podcast and a colleague of mine at Bleacher Report, has developed a pretty in-depth theory about the utility of cheating in MMA, which Dundasso. So, like, not to go full Dundasso here, but like, it is the referee's job to control the fight.
Yeah,
I firmly believe that. And if you're going to let somebody get away with fence grabs, if you're going to let somebody get away with eye pokes, if you're going to let somebody get away with fighting right to the bell or even just a step afterwards, like, it is at the end of the day the referee's job to do that, because it's a fighter's job to try and win. And frankly, the rules, as we have seen, are bendable. They are not firm. So I don't blame fighters for trying to bend them. Like, it's the referee's job to make sure those rules stay firm.
Yeah. I can at the same time admire a fighter in some weird way for bending the rules and still be upset that the referee didn't stop them from doing so.
Yeah, I think that to me is a reasonable position to take. And
in some ways, it's an adversarial relationship there. The fighter is trying to get away with whatever they can, and it's the referee's job to make sure they don't.
Yeah, I'm not going to be bothered by this. Is not going to stick in my memory of this fight. Maybe it's because we watch too many fights, but I don't care that much. I'm not going to get up in arms about it.
Well, so ends the first segment of this episode with a resounding shrug, I suppose, and a meh. It was an intriguing fight. It should present some interesting opportunities going forward for both women, but not altogether a satisfying end to a sort of disappointing event. So let's talk about some of the other fights from that event when we come back from this break, namely the co-main event feature between former middleweight kingpin Anderson Silva and Derek Brunson. More controversy regarding the scoring in that fight, of course, but also some really interesting gamesmanship and tactics in the fight itself. So we will talk about that and more after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands segment number 2. And Anderson Silva, Derek Brunson. Interesting fight. A lot of people feel very strongly about this one. And whereas I drew a hard line on the last fight, Pat, Jermaine Randamie clearly beating Holly Holm in my eyes, with really no gray area. I guess you could argue that it could have been a draw with a point deduction, but seeing as there was no point deduction, it's a non-issue. So I draw a hard line with that one. This one I have a harder time doing so. A lot of people feel that Derek Brunson was outright robbed, but I had difficulty, I think, scoring this fight that accurately going on, and I think the judges did too. And so I want to talk during this segment, if we can, a little bit about, what Anderson Silva did to make Derek Brunson look bad, because I think that was a big part of it. Derek Brunson did not look like he was comfortably winning the fight. And I do want to also pre-hype the article I'm going to do this week, which I'm thinking of calling Anderson Silva's win was bullshit, but it was good bullshit. So what did you make of this?
Well, I drew very heavily in my thoughts about this fight, both as it was happening and then afterwards, from the article that you wrote about the art of bullshit.
Which, that's what this article is going to be a follow-up to, because I think it's really, really pertinent to this performance.
Well, it was a perceptive point that you made back in the day with that article. That wasn't that long ago. It was a couple years ago, right?
Yeah, it was about Ben Henderson. What's that?
Was it after the Masvidal fight?
Maybe, yeah. I think I referenced Ben Henderson.
It was about Ben Henderson. I just can't remember which fight you were talking about.
Yeah, I'll look into it.
Like, so at any rate, though, I mean, the idea, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Connor, is basically that looking like you're winning a fight matters. Mm-hmm. If you're making your opponent miss, if you're the one who's doing the big flashy bits of offense, if you're the one moving forward, if your opponent's backing up, if you look like you have the initiative, then that exerts a powerful effect on people. And to some extent, appearance is reality. Mm-hmm. And Anderson Silva, this has been an increasingly big part of his game for years now. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post before he was scheduled to fight Uriah Hall. And we talked about this a little bit last week, so I don't want to go into too much depth about it. But basically, Silva has been out of his prime since 2008 or 2009. Like, he has not been the same fighter that he was when he burst into the UFC, that he was when he was, like, demolishing dudes like Tony Frickland. Like, that run, his early UFC run, like his first 5 or 6 fights, was on another level. The fights after that are all more or less of a piece, where he slows down the pace, he slows down the volume, he turns into more of a counterpuncher, he's more of a boxer than a kicker. He adjusted his tools to account for aging, and a lot of what we think of as the classic Anderson Silva run was actually his post-prime. Mm-hmm. But swagger and confidence and these kinds of big flashy moments, this understanding of cage psychology is essential to that. It's not separable from it, like, because you need to do something to control the pace. You need to do something to force your opponent into the kind of fight that you want, the pace, the distance, the angles, the location in the cage, all of that. You need to be in control of it. So how do you do that? By fucking with his head. Yeah. And that's exactly what Anderson Silva did here.
Yeah. And in the process, I think it's, the reason I say it's bullshit, but it's good bullshit. And this was a major point of contention, by the way. The article I published was called Benson Henderson and the Art of Bullshit. That was published back just after his win over Josh Thompson, which a lot of people disagreed with at the time. And the major point of disagreement was that I called it bullshit, which is what I was taught when I was first trying to study this kind of thing, that you're bullshitting. I think it's a charming sort of rough way of referring to something. It suits, I believe, combat sports to call it bullshit rather than the creation of narrative or something a little more flowery. So it's not, when I say that a fighter's bullshitting in the context of a fight, I am not maligning that fighter. I'm not saying that they're doing something wrong or that even necessarily that they don't deserve to benefit from their bullshitting. To me, just as we said with the referees and fighters fouling, it's a fighter's job to convince the judges and the fans and the opponent that they are winning. And it is a judge's job, and to some extent, I think the educated fan's job, and certainly the opponent's job, to see through that. And if they fail to see through that, I have a lot of difficulty really being upset when that fighter's given the win. I find it pretty easy to celebrate what Anderson Silva did here by taking advantage of the fact that Brunson, who had just been knocked out, that I think added to the mystique. That it brought back some of the mystique that Anderson used to have as champion before he had sort of been, quote unquote, exposed. That Brunson had just been knocked out, and now he was fighting the Spider. Now he was fighting one of the greatest, most precise, most dangerous counterpunchers and finishers in the history of the sport. And that brought back the fact that Brunson had just been taught a lesson by a good counterpuncher, brought back some of that mystique. And that mystique is essential to Anderson Silva's success in his post-prime career. It always has been. And with that mystique back on his side, Anderson was pretty remarkably, pretty beautifully, I would say, able to take advantage of the fact that Brunson was left in this unhappy middle ground between being way too aggressive and way too cautious. And so basically, he put Brunson into a position where it was hard for him to look good. It was hard for him to look like he was confidently doing anything that he actually came into the fight wanting to do. Whereas Anderson, even when he was getting hit, it felt like it was just happenstance. Like, yeah, everybody gets hit when Anderson gets hit, but when he nails Brunson with a jab or hits him with a spinning kick that is blocked, it looks like Anderson controlling the fight. And so it sells a story to everybody who's scoring, and it sells a story to Derek Brunson. Derek Brunson certainly wasn't confident even going into that third round. In fact, I think he was starting to look tired and was wearing out. So
that's he looked mentally exhausted,
right,
to me.
Yeah, I think he was,
from the strain of dealing with what Silva was showing him. Like, you hit on something really important there, Connor, and that's that bullshit serves to sell a narrative of a fight. It's telling observers a story about what's happening there that may not necessarily reflect reality, but it overpowers it. It sits on the raw bones of what's actually happening in the cage, and it worms its way into your brain and convinces you. Bullshit is an argument. Yeah. It's a narrative about what's happening in the cage that can overpower the raw evidence that it's built on.
It's you saying, I'm doing what I want to do, no matter what's actually happening. You might make yourself look busier than you are. You might no-sell the opponent's strike so you look like you're not getting hurt. You might time your strikes so well, even when you only throw a third as many as your opponent, that it really snaps the other guy's head back and looks big, and that sticks in the mind. You might... typical tactics are bullshit, like waiting for the last minute to shoot a takedown and ending the round with 30 seconds of top control. That's bullshit. It doesn't have any more significance than a takedown that is executed in the beginning of the round. It shouldn't, but in effect it does. It is de facto, it is an effective way to win rounds. And so, it's how you respond to what's going on in the fight, how confident you appear. If Mel Gibson at the end of Braveheart had been crying as he was disemboweled, that's a loss, right? Take the L, Mel. But if he screams freedom, he seems like a winner, even though he clearly is not enjoying the experience or doing what objectively most of us would want to do. The narrative you create with your actions in the face of adversity really does matter. And again, I have a lot of respect for fighters who are able to manipulate that, whether it's late career Bernard Hopkins or Floyd Mayweather. There are a lot of great fighters. Benson Henderson during his championship run, Anderson Silva during much of his late career. There are a lot of great fighters, and I think it's a respectable skill. I think it's something that we should analyze more and not be shy to talk about it.
Jose Aldo, great bullshitter too.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Jose Aldo is among the very best.
Yeah, I think
Uriah Faber turned into a good bullshitter too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
As he got deep into his career.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't. When I say it was a bullshit win, I don't agree with the people who come up to me and say, how can you respect the fact that it was a bullshit win? Nor do I agree with the people who come up to me and say, no, it wasn't a bullshit win. He clearly, being a smart in this context, being a smart mark is important because you have to be able to appreciate the skill that goes into creating that story, but also be objective enough to recognize that it is a story being created and not one that is just coming out of circumstance.
Yeah, fundamentally agree with that. There was one moment that really stuck out to me as the moment that allowed Silva to impose this game on Brunson. That was about 90 seconds in. Brunson threw really committed to his first strike of the fight, and Silva just nails him with the crispest right hook counter he's thrown since the Okami fight back in 2011.
And Silva, by the way, he still has that speed and that power. It's only in bursts now. It seems that stamina and durability have been the biggest things to affect him, but he still has some real pop. So when he gets those opportunities, how can I hate him for capitalizing on them in the best way possible?
Yeah, but it's like as soon as Silva landed that one right hook, it's not just that he landed that shot. It's that he knew what that was going to do to Brunson psychologically and how that was going to allow him to impose the rest of his game.
Yes.
So I thought this was a masterpiece of a performance from a pretty clearly faded Silva that made use of everything that he had under his belt. Even if it wasn't like a barn burner of a fight, I think it was a better fight in hindsight than maybe it was watching it the first time through. Yeah. Watching it on the replay, I was like, "Holy shit! There's a lot happening here."
Yeah, it's when you look at it through the lens of trying to appreciate the mental gamesmanship going on, it becomes really fascinating.
Yeah, so didn't hate it, enjoyed it on that front. I understand the scoring. And it's hard for me. It's really hard for me to get worked up about decisions like this, where there's not that much action, there's not that much happening. And basically all of Brunson's offense came in the form of short punches in the clinch. Those are inherently hard to score. How hard are those shots? We know from previous fights that Brunson throws those pretty fucking hard. So, but if Silva is rolling with them and he's kind of no-selling them, how effective are they really? That's not easy to score. I don't blame the judges, even though I scored it for Brunson live. In hindsight, on a rewatch, I think I probably would score it 29-28 for Silva. It is hard for me to get worked up about decisions like this.
Yeah.
Simply because there's not that much going on. There's not that much happening. You don't have that much to work with. You're really going to get yourself tied up into a knot about this.
Yeah,
Come on, man.
That's
There's
my
a lot of
feeling too.
fights.
It was a genuinely close and competitive fight, and the deciding factor was that Anderson Silva knows how to win that kind of fight for the judges. He knows how to make it look like that's the kind of fight he wants.
That's a really excellent point. He knows how to make it he knows how to win that kind of fight. That's absolutely
make
true.
It look less competitive than it is. He's edging that opinion. So yeah, I respect it. I think it was really great. And I'm actually looking forward to like rewatching it, writing an article about it, because it is fascinating. It's a fascinating topic that no one really talks about. So bullshitting, it's the way of the future. And it's the way of the old fighter. I was saying recently that old fighters shouldn't have no qualms about playing any dirty tricks or, being boring or whatever if it means winning a fight.
Well, we're getting to a point now where we have enough old fighters who are still operating at a relatively high level that this is becoming more of a genre than it used to be.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole generation of guys who started fighting between like 2002 and 2005 who are now getting toward the very end of their prime or past their prime, but they're still winning fights because they know how to do all this shit. Mm-hmm. And that's not like there weren't enough guys who started fighting in 97, 98, 99, that generation. Like there are just more fighters who started fighting 5-6 years later, who can kind of develop all these skills. There are enough of them left over operating at that level that they're there. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, kind of a weird demographic point about like the age distribution of MMA fighters right now. So we're going to see more of this, not less.
Doesn't bother me. You know what I mean? I enjoyed the last few years of B-Hop's career. I look forward to seeing more old guys surprise people that they're not supposed to beat. I think that's fine. That's part of one of the many reasons I love combat sports in the first place. So go old guys, go Anderson Silva. Good to see you with another win, man. It was a good feeling for people who have followed his career for a long time, no doubt.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we want to say something real quick about Poirier Miller, or do you think we need to move on to the next?
Let's quickly say a point about Poirier Miller before we move on to the next segment.
So I thought Poirier, he had talked a lot, and the announcers mentioned this about wanting to emphasize his defense on sticking and moving more, and I thought he did a really good job of that before he hurt his leg. I thought he did a really good job of using his length, of using his jab. His jab looked great in this fight. When he got into the pocket, he moved his head more than he ever has in the past. Like the key for Poirier, and I think he understands this, and I think his coaches understand it, is that he's never going to be some like stick and move out fighter. That's not really his game. But the point is to make him as effective and responsible a puncher as possible. So when he exchanged in this fight, in the past, Poirier has been happy to throw bombs wherever you are in the cage. In this fight, he only exchanged when he backed Miller up to the fence. Mm-hmm. He was not throwing in open space. And when he was throwing in those exchanges, he was moving his head, he was parrying, he was blocking, he was still moving his feet, which in the pocket, which he's always done pretty well. So like there were layers of defense there that kept him from getting clocked with some of the shots that he's eaten in the past.
Sure. I think those saying that Poirier failed to fight a smarter fight after expressing his interest in doing so, I think they're, as with many things from our perspective in the fight world, those people are suffering from a fundamental misunderstanding of how styles work. Making Dustin Poirier be a defensive stylist would be bad for Dustin Poirier, just as it would be bad for Justin Gaethje, or like having the ability to do that in your pocket is always good. Having some flexibility in how you strategically approach a fight, but Dustin Poirier's defense should serve what Dustin Poirier does well. So Dustin Poirier fighting a smarter fight does not mean not going after somebody and trying to knock their goddamn head off. It means doing it without getting hit much in return. And against a particularly sharp Jim Miller, I think he did a pretty good job of that. A lot of Jim Miller's counters were bouncing off the forehead or hitting shoulders a little bit. And while he was landing clean shots, he was never outlanding Poirier, who, he definitely fired himself up and got into a bit of a war, but that is what Dustin Poirier is good at. And so I think any adjustments to his style any adjustments to his technique or strategy should play into that. I think it would be a terrible mistake to say, Dustin Poirier, you are aggressive and you hit really hard. Let's work behind a jab and make the other guy come after you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly my thought process on this. Like that's exactly the right answer. And I think we saw in stretches now Poirier is getting more comfortable sticking and moving. like he was doing for the first couple of minutes of the fight. He was putting together really nice punch kick combinations. He was moving well in space. He was much lighter on his feet, not quite as plodding as he has been at some points in the past. Like Poirier has always been an excellent athlete, and that to some extent has disguised how flat-footed he can be a lot of the time. And when he does that little thing where he throws a strike and then he comes up on his toes afterwards and admires his work a little bit, you can kind of get caught up in looking at that and think, oh, he moves pretty well. He's light on his feet. Like that has not been Poirier in the past. Poirier likes to be rooted. But you can be a kind of a stick and move guy at times who isn't as rooted. Like you can move between those modes, and I think we saw Poirier figuring out how to do that.
Yeah. When Jack Blackburn saw that Joe Louis could punch like a motherfucker and said, we need to make sure this guy is as balanced as he can be as often as possible so he can knock people's heads off, that was the right move. Thank God that Jack Blackburn did not try to turn Joe Louis into a slickster who fought on the outside and danced around on his toes. Yeah. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
And props
that's one of the things I really like about ATT is they seem to be flexible stylistically.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Like very much so.
The one gym produces fighters like Tisha Torres or Dustin Poirier or Robbie Lawler, all very different fighters with very different specialties. Props, by the way, before we head out to this segment, to Jim Miller. I think both you and I probably underestimated the impact that the Lyme's disease he was suffering from, and is still, because it's not really a curable disease as I understand it, the effect that had on him as a fighter. Because you and I think, and other people that I've talked to about this, Zane Simon on the Bloody Elbow Vivisections, basically thought that after that Diego Sanchez loss, that Jim Miller was probably nearing the end of his time as a top fighter. At least the end of his time as an elite journeyman, as we would call it. And now that he's saying so much about having his Lyme's disease under control, the medication helping, he looks better, not only better than he did then, but better than he ever has. I mean, Jim Miller, I think, still has quite a bit left in the tank, and he put on a really, really solid performance here. By the way, I don't think that the draw card was as bad as the 30-27 for Dustin Poirier. Not to just talk about judging for the entire episode, but a draw card means rounds 1 and 3 for Jim Miller. I don't think he should have gotten round 1, but I can see it. He landed a lot of good kicks in that round. And round 2 would be a 10-8 for Poirier. I don't think that's indefensible. I think giving Dustin Poirier the third round, just because he basically chose a smart tactic and survived when most of us thought his leg was broken, I don't think that's a good scorecard at all.
Yeah. I'm going to be really interested to see what Miller does from here. I hope he takes a little time off, because this was his 4th fight in 11 months. So he's been real active recently. He's looked great his last 3 outings. He looked great against Joe Lozon. He looked great in destroying Takanori Gomi. He looked great against Thiago Alves, I thought. And he looked good here. He looked really good. And I think this was a really tough stylistic matchup for him, because another southpaw who's a little bit bigger, a little bit longer, throws with more power, can match him as a wrestler and grappler, was not going to walk into something stupid on the ground. Like, that's a tough stylistic matchup for Jim Miller, and he still looked good and still put on a fight of the night performance. Like, this was, can you believe this, Connor? This was his 26th UFC fight.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, but I think he may well set the record by the time everything's said and done. I could easily see him walking out of the UFC with 33, 34 fights under his belt if he can do this for another 2.5, 3 years.
Yeah, 33 years old, still looking strong, man. Looking better than he did at 31, and that's for damn sure.
In our bonus episode, we talked a lot about kind of journeyman, and honestly, I think Jim Miller may be my favorite.
He's awesome.
I just love him. He's been around forever. He's a great fighter. He knows everything. Like, he can do everything. He's fought everybody. Like, I just fucking love it, you know?
Yeah, and then performances like this, where he seems to be done and he's just surges back near what should be the end of his career, they only heighten the romance of Jim Miller from a fight fan's perspective. It only makes him more intriguing and more fun to care about his fights. So go Jim Miller, go Dustin Poirier. You guys were a rare glimmer, a rare highlight in an otherwise pretty barren UFC pay-per-view.
One real quick note on that, like, this is always awesome to me when I see this, and I know that I'm marking out a little bit, but like Poirier put up an Instagram photo where he was like, shout out to Jim Miller, it was a great fight, and of course Miller gets on their comments and says, it was a pleasure to do this with you, and they have a little back and forth, and it's like, it makes me really happy to see that kind of thing.
Yeah, seeing Hendo and Shogun like arm in arm at the hospital. There's something about that you just have to love, that level of respect.
Yeah, so props to them. It was a great fight. Really happy to see that. I hope we see those two guys out there for a long time together, because this is like fights like that. Even if they don't turn into like all out barn burner wars, this was a really good fight, but not, I don't think, a great one. Like fights like this are the lifeblood of the UFC.
Yeah. Yeah, you need these. You need these guys to fill out cards. Without them, every card would be a UFC 208. You know what I mean?
Jesus, fuck, man.
We need
Never
more.
Again.
We need more guys like them. Well, speaking of disappointing fight cards, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back...
That's a strong pitch to our listeners to stick around for the third segment.
Well, we're also going to try to get to some one or two heavy bag questions, so stick around for that. A few of you guys asked interesting questions that we're going to try to get to, and we are going to do our best to find what matters about the big fights from UFC Fight Night 105 after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Now, we are going to get to the heavy bag in a moment, but first, let's quickly, Pat, try to, in the least heavyweight-esque fashion possible, let's try to get through Derek Lewis versus Travis Browne. Now, I don't mean to sound like too much of a downer here, because Travis Browne's typically in fun fights. Derek Lewis is a crazy knockout machine who lives and dies by the sword, with very few exceptions. That sounds good, but it is always hard for me to get really invested in a sub-top 5 heavyweight main event, if you know what I mean.
That's just good planning, not getting invested in a heavyweight main event.
I'm not pessimistic, I'm just realistic, right?
There is a real chance that this is just a god-awful fight. There's also a real chance it ends in the first 3 minutes.
Yes.
There's a wide range of possibilities here. Let's just say we're not holding our breath for the ones that lead to nonstop action and entertainment. Was that fair?
Yeah, that's heavyweight. That's just what you learn. I mean, I think somebody posted recently somewhere about the ways that title fights have ended in each respective divisions, and heavyweight had an abundance of 2 things: knockouts and decisions. That is, You get basically a pretty equal spread of both, because the talent is not that great, the stamina is not that great across the board, and so when the fights aren't good, they tend to be really not good.
That's kind of the nature of the beast. There are a lot of ways for heavyweight fights to go wrong, really wrong, and that's kind of what we've seen from this. So Derek Lewis, God bless him, put on a stinker of a fight with Shamil Abdurakhimov that he managed to salvage with a pretty brutal 4th round finish. Mm-hmm. So props to Derek Lewis for doing that. Derek Lewis, a fantastic personality, a breath of fresh air in this division.
Oh yeah.
As a charismatic person who can talk a little bit, who's got a personality that he's putting out there as much as he can. Like, I love Derek Lewis.
Who is willing to post pictures that suggest he's constantly getting drunk, taking shits, and jacking off on social media. Yeah, I don't mind. Yep. Derek Lewis is a real dude. I'm okay with that.
I just my favorite one is when he took the video of him on the bike at the gym doing a round of cardio, and the buzzer ends. Somebody comes over, hands him a beer. He pops the top off, starts drinking the beer, and says, "Almost lost too much damn weight."
You gotta love Derek Lewis.
Like, I love that. So,
yeah. Speaking of the nature of the beast, the nature of the black beast in this case, that win over Shamil Abdurakhimov is even more than his many first round knockouts. In my opinion, the quintessential Derek Lewis fight, because that it represents everything that makes Derek Lewis, all of his limitations and his strengths, and what has allowed him, I think, to evolve as a fighter without necessarily doing so in a way that fits the current metagame of MMA. Because I think a lot of what makes Derek Lewis more effective now than he used to be is that he just doesn't care about losing rounds, which is a very viable strategy for someone who can knock anybody out with a single punch. He just doesn't care as much about being taken down and held down. And it's especially viable now that he's finding himself in 5-round main event fights, because Shamil Abdurakhimov may get a great takedown and get some top control and cause Derek Lewis to lose the round. Or he may pepper him with shots and Derek Lewis will swing big and miss big and not get anything. But all Derek Lewis really needs to concern himself with, the bare necessities of his style, is that he has enough energy in the tank to get a slim chance of landing one punch in each of those 25 minutes he's given.
Yep, that's the entire basis of his game. He's exceptionally patient. He's patient to the point of inactivity, large stretches of time. He does not have great footwork at range, though he likes to kind of patiently stalk you. He doesn't throw a lot of volume. Basically, everything that he does is focused around throwing 1 or 2 hard punches, barreling forward into the clinch, pressing you up against the fence, and trying to take you down.
Yep.
And once he gets on top, it only takes him 2 or 3 punches to end your night. That's it. Like, that's the entirety of his game, as far as we can tell. Like, he hasn't really shown much of anything else, even if he does have some different tools in his arsenal.
But it's actually, for Derek Lewis, it's kind of a refreshing change, because he used to be a guy who used to freak out when he was taken down. Used to freak out when somebody was exchanging with him and would waste his energy. Now, not only is he safer because he doesn't try to scramble free and put himself in bad positions, or he doesn't try to exchange at all costs and get himself hit. He picks his spots. It also makes him more effective in a consistent way, because he's an efficient fighter now. It's basically as efficient as a gigantic knockout artist can be by sort of becoming an artless late career Anderson Silva.
Yeah, it's an interesting game that he has. Like, I don't fault him for that.
No.
Like, I think it actually suits his personality. It suits his physicality. It's a nice adaptation to what are some fairly obvious weaknesses of his. Like, he's been very open about his nervousness, about the fact that he's not like a huge fan of actually going out there and fighting. That's not really his thing. He just happens to be good at it. So this is the kind of game that suits somebody who knows himself.
Yeah, just stay chill and wait for your time.
Yeah, exactly. That's a viable approach for him. Now, how do you see that matching up with Travis Brown, whatever we make of the 2017 version of Travis Brown, Connor?
God knows what's going on to Travis Brown these days. Boy, I think Travis Brown is almost a more disappointing Edmund Tarverdian student than Ronda Rousey. Perhaps because his competition is better, although, boy, is that saying a shitty thing about women's bantamweight, since we're talking about the UFC heavyweight division being better than it. But Travis Brown, I think, is worse than his girlfriend as a student of Tarverdian, because he doesn't really seem to ever have an idea of what he wants to do in a fight. If you hit Ronda Rousey on the chin, by God, she decides she's going to run you down. And that makes sense against a lot of her competition. It's gotten her in trouble. It's not a good thing to do against people like Amanda Nunes and Holly Holm, but she knew what she wanted to do. She had a very definite goal in her striking. Travis Brown's goal is like a less consistent version to me of Derek Lewis's goal with less power and maybe less flexibility, where he just seems to kind of be waiting. And I ask myself often, when watching Travis Brown fight, I ask him silently, what are you doing right now to win this fight? And I can never really come up with an answer. With Derek Lewis, with a guy who's so powerful, I get it, and I don't expect Derek Lewis to be necessarily forging his way to a title shot or anything. I get it. I think it's a viable strategy, and it makes sense. If he's not going to make tons of technical improvements or get a much better gas tank or whatever, yeah, wait for your shot, man. Survive and wait for your shot. For Travis Brown,
I think that Lewis has made improvements, though. Like, he is demonstrably better as a takedown artist, as a clinch fighter,
sure,
as a puncher
than
fair. He was a few fights ago. It's just, it comes in such limited bursts. It's not like he's constantly popping this razor sharp jab into his opponent's face. Like, so we're not seeing him doing 150 different things a fight for us to pick apart and break down.
The changes Derek Lewis makes, whether it's like meditating every time he's taken down, or moving his feet a little better, or throwing his punches straighter, those make absolute sense for who Derek Lewis is as a fighter. I'm not sure that turning Travis Browne into a sort of reluctant counterpuncher makes sense for Travis Browne.
I don't have the slightest. I would echo exactly what you said about him. I don't have the slightest fucking idea of what Travis Browne thinks he's doing in a fight. Like, even you go back and watch the second Verdum fight again, Browne's most recent outing, and even before he breaks his finger, which is fairly obviously a turning point in that fight, it's not clear what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish.
He's just hoping to land a punch. Is he trying to stick and move? Does he want to pressure Verdum? Is he just like letting Verdum come to him? Who the fuck knows, man? It's impossible to say. And that's the case in all of Browne's fights since he started working with Edmond. Like, so I think if you look at any individual strike that Browne throws now, and I'll give Terverdian credit for this, it looks better. It looks more technical. He throws a sharper jab. He throws a much better right hand. Browne's right has always had power in his right hand. Now it looks like the straight right that you would teach somebody to throw. Sure.
So that's good, right? Like, he keeps his feet moving under him. His footwork seems to be better. But there's no plan. There's no overarching idea of what are we trying to accomplish with any individual strike we throw. It's
a sort of approach to fighting that is wholly absorbed with tactics, with how do you respond to this strike or this strike, and not trying to build those into any sort of strategy. It's tactics without direction, without a framework. It's like a few interesting characters without a plot. And there's some technical improvements there, but I think if you're going to be a sort of a flow fighter, your techniques have to be really good. You know what I mean?
Browns are not really good.
Yeah, right. You have to have really good defense. You have to have really good counterpunching, or you have to be really powerful. And when you're not a technical wizard, having a style where you don't do what Browne used to do at Jackson Winklejohn, when you don't shorten the fight, as you like to say, when you don't account for your shortcomings and take advantage of the other person's predicted weaknesses in any kind of consistent way, then boy, it's hard to have hope for you as a fighter.
Yeah. So on that note, that's why I'm picking Lewis here, because you would think on a basic technical level, this would be a matchup that favors Browne.
Yeah.
That he moves well in space. He's quick. He's probably not going to walk himself backward into the fence where Lewis can do that. He tends to work even now at a pretty good pace. He can pile up volume. He's long. Like, these are all advantages that we would think on paper that he has, but I have no confidence in his ability to make that a viable plan to work for 3 or 5 rounds without getting at some point taken down and shit kicked.
Yeah. How's he going to increase his chances of landing that big shot against a guy whose baseline chances of making that one big shot effective are much higher?
Yeah. It's like, and there's a good chance. The betting odds are almost even in this fight. There's a good chance Browne clocks Lewis with a good shot. Lewis doesn't have the world's best chin and just finishes him. And that's it. And we're all looking at this like, oh, of course that was going to happen because Browne is a much better striker. But like, without looking at what Browne has done recently and saying there's some sort of coherent idea here, I don't know how you can feel comfortable picking him, much less betting on him, putting your money on Travis Browne. That's insane.
I think it's also fairly likely that Travis Browne does to Lewis what Lewis does to many others and beats him up from top position.
Also true. Yeah, that's
Derek's,
possible.
Derek's takedown defense. Yeah, and his Derek's takedown defense is not great. It's I would say it's worse than Jared Cannonier's was against Glover Teixeira. Let's put it that way. So
give him I think he's a little better than that.
Yeah, but it's still very lazy sometimes, where it's just kind of like stiff-legged, like sort of just trying to walk out of a takedown. He's better than he was. I will give him that.
Yeah. Well, so real quick, do you want to talk about Lombard Hendricks? What do you make of this fight?
Oh man,
do you think guys just way on their way down?
Yeah, definitely. Do you think Johnny Hendricks is sort of a Mike Brown? That maybe he just reached the peak of his career at the very end of his physical prime, and that he's just, he doesn't look all that much like a worse fighter. Technically, he's looking a lot like he did in that Robbie Lawler fight, the first Robbie Lawler fight, or the George St. Pierre fight. The techniques are still there. I think he's even still learning and improving and trying to add new things to his game. but there's something missing, right? And I can't quite put my finger on what it is. There's something holding Johnny Hendricks back from competing with other fighters.
I think there's a few things going on here. And I just wrote this section of my preview, so I'll draw on that a little bit. Mm-hmm. But so I think, first of all, the years of bad weight cuts, going all the way back to, I bet Hendricks was not exactly doing weight cutting best practices when he was 16 years old.
Sure.
He's 33 now, and it's an old 33. Like, he has put a lot of mileage on his body. And so your point about Mike Brown is an interesting one. I think that's a really good point, because I think Brown was 34 or 35 and kind of fell off a cliff all of a sudden.
Brown he was very good, and then right when he got to the top of the mountain, he stopped. He lost his ability to hang on and stay there.
Yeah, like Hendricks won the title when he was 31, I think, 30 or 31, and there's just a chance that, like, somebody who's been competing at a high level since he was 14 or 15 years old, and cutting weight all the time and spending all that time in the gym, all that time on the mats, that just takes a toll on your body, especially when you combine it with just what are fairly obviously not best practices for getting your weight down. That has just taken a toll on his body, and he can't deal with it anymore. This is the second thing is kind of I don't think that this has really been brought up all that much, but I'll raise it. And that's that Hendricks is not good defensively, and never has been good defensively, and has always gotten hit a lot. And now suddenly he's in there with guys who are willing to throw volume with him, and he's just eating a shitload of shots. Every fight he's getting hit a lot.
Yeah.
So when he's facing accurate, high-volume strikers, there's not much that he can do about that, especially when he's stuck outside a couple of inches. And then, the last thing to me is Hendricks, to some extent, has always been a guy who's been in close fights. If he doesn't knock you out, his fights are always close. And now that he's, for whatever reason, not knocking people out anymore, every fight is razor thin. And to some extent, it's a regression to the mean, that all of those close decisions that he pulled out in fights against, like, the first Lawler fight, like, one or two things goes different, he loses that decision.
Yeah.
As we saw in the second Lawler fight, something went wrong and he lost that decision.
It's back to the Rick Story days, which has maybe always been that's just the base of what to expect from Johnny Hendricks if he doesn't put you away.
He's a fucking grinder. Yeah. And I think at heart, that's what he is. He's a grinder who can kickbox a little bit. And if everything doesn't go right for a grinder, you fall off real fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I think all of that's in there. As far as Lombard's concerned, his problems are much more straightforward and much more related to age. Like, he's not quite as fast as he used to be. His reflexes are noticeably slower. He has never been like a fantastic technician. He's a burst fighter. And when your age goes, or when your physicality starts to go a little bit, that's a tough adjustment to make if you don't have a huge, tremendous base of deep technique to fall back on.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's all very prescient to me. Do you think? I mean, I'm thinking it feels pretty easy to pick Hendricks here, and maybe it shouldn't. But I do think I have some hope here that not cutting weight, take some of that strain off of Johnny, and put him in a division where he's once again, even if he's slowed down, more explosive than his opponents by and large, will help him. I think we may very well see the first Hendricks knockout in quite a while, since I guess 2012 is the last time this guy, who's many were talking about as one of the hardest hitters in welterweight history, hasn't knocked anyone out since 2012. That's crazy.
Yeah, I'm taking Lombard here, just because I think Hendricks has looked so underwhelming that if he can't wrestle, if he's just going to go out there and kickbox because for all of the things in Lombard's game that have deteriorated, his takedown defense is not one of them unless he's totally exhausted.
Nor his takedowns. I mean, his judo is pretty phenomenal.
So
nobody ragdolls Jake Shields if he doesn't have a good takedown and wrestling game.
Yeah, I mean, and Lombard has ragdolled a lot of people. He ragdolled Dan Henderson. Not that's like the world's most difficult
but
task.
With ease. I mean, easier than Daniel Cormier did, arguably.
Yeah, so I don't know. I just think that, like, until we see Hendricks put things together in some sort of coherent fashion, it's really hard for me to pick him, because I can easily foresee a scenario in which Hendricks is like, oh man, I got to go out there. I got to get the win. He tries to clinch up with Lombard. He gets judo tossed. When he gets back to his feet, he gets pummeled. He gets judo tossed again. Hendricks manages to put together enough of a burst of offense to keep the round close. We repeat that in kind of a slow-paced fight for 3 rounds. We get to the end of it. Lombard wins a 29-28 decision. Hendricks just like, well, I don't know, man. I came out and I did my thing. And then we're kind of exactly where we were at before.
It's a good Texas accent.
It's just so hard for me to pick Hendricks, having seen what we've seen from him, because he seems to fight down to whatever's happening in a fight.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. You're onto something there. And it's hard for me to go away from, like we've talked to Stephen Wright, the War Man.
We like Stephen a lot.
Yeah, love Stephen. He's a great guy, very intelligent. I think he's done a lot of good things with Johnny, and it just may be an unfortunate truth that Johnny Hendricks just doesn't have it anymore. So we'll see. I mean, Hector Lombard doesn't have it anymore either, but then again, Hector Lombard's a bigger dude with a really good wrestling game. So yeah, as you say, it may be more than enough at this point to outfight Johnny Hendricks in a division he's never competed in before. Yeah.
So real quick, do we have time to get to that heavy bag question, Connor, or are we about it?
We do. Let's run through it as quickly as we can. And that question comes to us from Bryce Felt. And, don't you love that? When the sound effect is on auto loop. We run a professional production here. We're on a tight ship. Bryce asked us a little bit of what I would say is perhaps an aggressive question. Bryce, you said, will you two ever show respect for traditional martial arts? Be honest. And that's it. What do you make of that, Pat?
I think we have plenty of respect for traditional martial arts. I think what neither you nor I has much respect for are traditional martial arts in which people aren't actively trying to harm each other. That's what matters as far as effectiveness in combat sports. It's pretty straightforward. If you do live training, if you do live sparring, if you do live competition in which you are attempting to physically hurt each other, whether it's with grappling or takedowns or strikes, then your martial art is worthy of respect. Otherwise, you're shadow boxing, and it doesn't matter. So,
yeah. I think it's pertinent to mention the origins of the phrase self-defense for this, because a lot of people, the kind of traditional martial arts stuff that annoys me, and maybe this is why somebody like Bryce may have been given the impression that we don't have respect for TMAs, is the kind of stuff where people, you know the people, you know what I mean? The dudes who do Wing Chun, as Joe Rogan says, the dudes who are doing Wing Chun or Kung Fu in the park, black dudes doing Kung Fu in the park in New York, probably don't know that much about what it means to be a mixed martial artist. It doesn't translate necessarily well. And part of the problem with that is that this idea that it's self-defense. So there are no rules. So everything's different, right? How is your takedown going to work if I can elbow you in the back of the head? You know what I mean? How is your armbar going to work if I can bite your dick? You know what I mean? These tactics, they don't enter into things nearly as often as you think. And in reality, the origins of the phrase self-defense are basically just a bit of political correctness on the part of historical European martial artists who called their fencing arts the arts of defense, right? And now, a dude holding a sword trying to stab somebody that's not defense, right? Running away is defense in the purest sense. So the most effective martial arts, we might call them arts of self-defense, but the most effective martial arts are when you take an efficient, effective, and consistent route to hurting someone. That is what martial arts are for. They're not necessarily meant for self-defense. They're meant for martial artistry, for the art of combat. And yeah, so I think a lot of what makes some traditional martial arts less effective for MMA is that they're not trained like martial arts. You know what I mean? Martial arts means now many different things. There are a lot of martial arts competitions with choreographed displays of pretty technique and forms that don't really have a bearing in modern practice, that are sort of historical artifacts from a time in a lot of Asian countries when people, the government actively stripped the combat effectiveness out of martial arts, the traditional martial arts in those areas. And so the ones that are most effective in the octagon, I think, are the ones that are trained as if they're intended to hurt people, which is why we see people from judo backgrounds that are effective. That's a traditional martial art. In some ways a very limited one, but it's effective when it's applied correctly. We see people from Kyokushin backgrounds do well because those people try to hurt each other. People who do knockdown karate try to hurt each other. I maintain that people like Stephen Thompson and Lyoto Machida, who largely come from point sparring backgrounds, are the exception and not the rule, because the average person who dedicates 10 years of their life to perfecting a competitive sport in which they are not trying to hurt someone is not going to have an easy time transitioning to a sport where everybody they face wants to hurt them as badly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of tough people who do traditional martial arts, and I think we have plenty of respect for them.
Sure.
But this combat sports, from our perspective, and MMA in particular, is much less about like what techniques can you throw and more about what are you actively trying to do in a broader strategic sense to win this fight. That I think is the uniting thing that brings together your perspective and my perspective, and it's how we think about this show. It's how we think about, because it's how we think about MMA in general. I think that underpins all of the work that we do.
Sure.
And I don't feel like you nor I has a lot of patience for like beating up the air with a kata. Like, I don't think that really appeals to either one of us.
No, I think some people out there from traditional martial arts backgrounds would get the impression that we don't have respect for those arts because we often we spend more time than we would like to spend refuting questions like or sort of trying to deflect questions about, what's the next technique, because now people do spinning kicks now in MMA. So now traditional martial arts are back. They're effective. Karate is the new way. And I think it's a mistake to say, like, I've added karate to my game, now I've upgraded. You know what I mean? I've added spin kick to my game, now I've upgraded my game. It's more about what suits that fighter's style and what you can allow to be effective. And we're still going to discover, fighters who can make esoteric techniques effective for their styles, but that's not going to mean across the board that those styles are effective for everyone. Like, not most people cannot do what Stephen Thompson does with his kicks.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the fighters that we enjoy the most and talk about the most, they have done traditional martial arts. Like GSP started off with karate. You know what Mirsad Bektic's first martial art was?
What's that?
Karate.
Yeah. Anderson Silva, Lyoto Machida. A lot of people from traditional martial arts backgrounds.
And we have a tremendous amount of respect for them and the techniques that they bring. There's like, I think it's a misnomer to say that we don't respect traditional martial arts. And
especially because Muay Thai, boxing, wrestling, those are also traditional martial arts. They're steeped in the traditions of their origins. They just don't seem as exotic to us.
Yeah, true. So I hope we have answered that question in sufficient depth to give a good answer.
It's not about how traditional the martial art is or from what part of the world, almost said what fart of the world, or from what part of the world it hails. It is about how effective it is in practice. That's it. I like seeing things that work. So thank you, Bryce, for your question. Hopefully we answered it to your satisfaction. Anybody else? Again, final call for this cycle. If you have not sent us a heavy bag question or a topic suggestion for our $20 patrons in the last few weeks or so, please go ahead. Let's say the last month when we've been asking for new questions, send them to us now. We will be getting to those, especially as we reach this dry spell of UFC cards coming up soon. So we will have need for your input, and we look forward to discussing all of the things that you are interested in having discussed. Before we wrap up the show, Pat, what do you have coming out this week?
Not a whole lot. I have a complete guide to this weekend's UFC Fight Night card, which I'm doing my very best to power through, despite the overall quality of the event. I will have a kind of a list article for Bleacher Report about the best fights the UFC can make right now, looking across all the weight classes. What are their best bets for both entertainment and for hopefully selling some pay-per-views so that all of us can keep our jobs in the MMA media. And then I will have a new episode of Fall of Rome out on Thursday. I'll be talking about the fall of the Roman economy. Not sure if I'll get it out this week, though we're going to try and record it this week. A new episode of History Matters, too, or I'll be talking to, hopefully, assuming he shows up, to my friend Stefan, who's a historian of political scandals. So we'll be talking about political scandal in the age of Trump and why nothing seems to stick to Teflon Don.
All right. Sounds very interesting. As for me, the usual Sherdog preview of UFC Fight Night 105, Lewis versus Brown. And all I'm really thinking about right now as far as other articles is that Anderson Silva article. Anderson Silva's win was bullshit, but it was good bullshit. I'm hoping to expand some mindsets with that. So we will see how well it goes, because a lot of people did not enjoy the Ben Henderson article, but I think it's an important topic to discuss. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully you guys are too. And if you have not listened already, check out the bonus episode that went out this week. That's bonus episode number 5. We discussed our favorite journeymen, including recent standouts like Jim Miller and many more. So go ahead and check that out. $3 patrons get access to 2 bonus episodes of Heavy Hands every month at least, and we've got some more things in the works for the future. A lot of good things for all you people who are kind enough to support us that we're working on and letting sort of percolate while we figure out how best to reward you. So thank you, everybody, for your support. Thank you for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.